Hello, everybody. Merry Christmas Eve 2023. Thanks for staying up. I'm Jeremy Veldman, and we have a kind of a quick show here for those of you who decided to stay up with us. It's about 11 o'clock Central Time. It's 11 p.m. So for those of you who are waiting for Santa to stop by, first of all, greetings, and hope that your holiday season is going well. I'm sure everybody's busy and trying to get things done. But we want to take a minute here to commemorate and acknowledge and look back and remember one of the historic moments, maybe in the history of civilization. And it's the 55th anniversary of the Apollo 8 journey to the moon, and specifically the broadcast from the moon on Christmas Eve of 1968. And I want to bring in once again my good buddy, Bill Weppner, former NASA flight controller who was on shift that night, Apollo 7 to Apollo 13, 1968 to 1970. How you doing, Bill?
Very well, Jeremy. Thanks for hosting this. It's fun to be able to reminisce a little bit about this mission that I was part of 55 years ago this very date.
Hard to believe, 55 years. Goes by very quick.
Well, as I say, most of the people in our audience probably were dreaming of sugar plums at this point in time on Christmas Eve. There's some who probably hadn't hit the ground yet. And so it's interesting. That tells you a little bit how old some of us were. But it was an amazing accomplishment by a bunch of really sharp engineers in their mid-20s to their mid-30s.
Yep. Absolutely. One of the great accomplishments in human history. First time human beings left the gravity of Earth to be ensnared by the sphere of influence, if you will, of another world.
Well, that's the amazing thing. I mean, the first time mankind of any country, any allegiance did that. And that's what makes it such a significant accomplishment.
Absolutely. Well, as we reminisce here, first of all, you send me this card every year. Thank you. And you kind of remind me that December is a great month. If you're interested in space, and of course, a year ago, we commemorated the 50th anniversary of Apollo 17, the last moon mission, and also the splashdown, the successful splashdown of Artemis 1, unmanned mission, but the first spacecraft designed to take human beings back to the moon. So it's exciting to see that project unfold. And of course, the blue marble, a picture I'm very fond of, as it was on my wall as a kid 40 years ago in the early 80s from Apollo 17. So a lot of memorable moments. And as we look back on this mission, Apollo 8, here are the astronauts, Frank Borman, Bill Anders, and Jim Lovell. And to kind of just put this high level here, and you can kind of help me fill in the blanks. So Mercury and Gemini were a success with the launching in low Earth orbit and specifically docking and rendezvous with Gemini. And then we had the tragedy of Apollo 1 in early 1967, January 27, 1967, when those three astronauts tragically lost their lives. And it was a setback for the program. So the command module was completely broken down, dissected, and rebuilt over a period of about 10 months before the successful launch of the Saturn V rocket on Apollo 4 on November 9, 1967. It's the first time that vehicle had flown, unmanned, of course. And as we got into 1968, there was another launch of the Saturn V, Apollo 6, had some complications. The second and third stage rockets didn't ignite correctly. In fact, I don't think the third stage ignited at all. And then they had some other issues with vibration in the Saturn V rocket that needed to be worked out. And about mid-cycle in 1968 is around the time that you got involved in the Apollo program. Can you tell me specifically when you got involved?
Specifically, it was in the spring. One holiday I remember, St. Patrick's Day. That was about the time that I arrived in Houston and signed in at NASA. I was a member of the Air Force at the time, and the Air Force had at that time a program that was eventually canceled a few years later. It was called the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. And so there was a cadre of about 200 Air Force officers assigned to NASA, mainly at NASA Houston, but some at the Cape also. and we were being trained about everything, all aspects of manned space flight. So I arrived there as I say, in March of '68. And then, so I didn't participate in the launch of Apollo 6. That was the following month. I looked over some flight controller's shoulders, but I wasn't a participant at all. My first mission was Apollo 7 in the fall of '68.
Yeah. So summer of '68, very turbulent year, of course, a lot going on politically and globally. We were the quagmire of Vietnam, which was escalating. And of course, we had the assassinations of Dr. King in April of 1968, and then RFK, I think it was June. Very turbulent Democratic National Convention in the fall, and just really a period of unease, both at home and abroad. So for those who were involved in the NASA and the Apollo missions, you guys were just kind of immersed in this program and really focused on the mission, which is obviously the next successful Apollo launch, and then also the ultimate objective, which was putting a man on the moon at the end of the decade. So about the time you get involved in the Apollo program, summer of '68, you're a year out from actually landing. Was your mindset that we could actually get this done?
Well, I was new, but the atmosphere was one mission at a time, and we just wanted to launch. So the first launch of Apollo 7 occurred in October of 1968. And this is something that I hope everybody can just kind of sit and ponder and appreciate what was accomplished in such a short period of time. Because we had the tragic fire in January of '67, rebuild the spacecraft, fly Apollo 6 in April of '68, and then in October of '68 was the first man. Now that was low Earth orbit, but it was, and we used a launch vehicle of a smaller version of the Saturn rocket that we used to launch men to the moon, but it was nonetheless the most powerful launch vehicle we had used up to the time. And this was on Apollo 7 in October.
Right.
And then 2 months later, a mere 8 weeks later, we went to the moon.
Right. So rewind to August of '68. So NASA has essentially a 7-step plan for getting to the moon. And the first step was essentially testing the command, service, and lunar modules in low Earth orbit. That was the original plan, I think, for Apollo 8. And then 9 would be similar, only correct. A longer, more elliptical orbit. And that was actually the mission that Frank Borman was originally scheduled to command, Apollo 9. And then, of course, from there, you go to the moon, you test the lunar module in orbit there, and then eventually you land. Well, the plan kind of changed when first of all, the lunar module wasn't ready for the launch of Apollo 8. So that set it back a few months. And it wouldn't have been until the spring of '69 before the lunar module was actually ready to be tested. And that would mean a possible delay for a lunar lander until maybe 1970, if not later. So that was an issue. The other issue was, I think, NASA had received word that the Russians had sent a mission to the moon to orbit the moon with not human beings, but tortoises. I think it was tortoises, living creatures, and possibly followed up by a manned mission to the moon by the end of 1968. So to kind of change course, since the lunar module wasn't ready, but the command and service modules were, Apollo 8 could fly to the moon, orbit the moon, do the objectives of the later missions for essentially scouting out landing spots as well as testing the mission to the moon. And then you could launch the command, service, and lunar modules when the lunar module is ready at a later date in early '69, and then still be on schedule to land on the moon. I'm kind of this is kind of high level, but can you tell me specifically when you received word that 8 was going to be basically going to the moon, to orbit the moon?
Well, as you summarized, Jeremy, the decision actually was made by the administration, George Low and the company in Washington in about August of '68. We, as I recall, the first time I heard that Apollo 8's mission was going to be lunar was during while we were controlling the mission of Apollo 7 in October, mid-October. And basically it was just kind of passed ear to ear. Have you heard we're going to the moon with Apollo 8? And as a matter of fact, the day after we splashed down from Apollo 7, we started simulations. In other words, practicing for Apollo 8.
Right.
So that was in around the 20th of October, give or take a couple of days.
So we're talking almost 2 months to the day before the launch, the actual launch of Apollo 8.
Two months to practice an entirely new mission outside of Earth orbit, something no one had ever done before.
Right. And only, 4 months, doing the math here, 6 months. If you go back to April of '68, when Apollo 6 was launched, I mean, you had the pogo oscillation issue that needed to be fixed. You had the second stage that didn't fire correctly, the third stage that didn't fire at all. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the crew of Apollo 8 would have been pretty much entirely dependent on that third stage rocket firing.
Oh, absolutely. Without the third stage, we wouldn't be able to do what we call translunar injection, which is firing that third stage again to take us out of Earth orbit and onto the way to the moon, a free return path to the moon.
Right.
And we were using the full up Saturn V system for Apollo 8 and all subsequent missions.
Right. So it was quite a leap, to say the least. So I wanted to mention also that Frank Borman, we lost him, unfortunately, a month and a half ago. Lived a long life, 95 years, pretty good. And the other two are still surviving. So Lovell and Anders are still with us. And
we're starting to lose that crew, and you can imagine. I mean, but they're all living a long time. Buzz Aldrin, I think, recently got married at age 93, and so he's at least 93, perhaps 94 now, and doing well as far as we know. But we lost Michael Collins recently.
Right.
But, living over 90 is a good life.
So I guess if you want to live long and prosper, choose a career in aviation and space flight, where you're risking your life in your 20s and 30s, but you make it to nearly 100. That's good. I like how you guys think. So Apollo 8, to kind of break it down here, it's the first mission to take humans to the moon and back, first crewed mission to launch aboard the Saturn V rocket. It's also the first crew to ascend from Launch Complex 39 at the Kennedy Space Center. The first to take images of Earth by humans from deep space. First live coverage of the lunar surface. And then you can see the distances here. The maximum distance of about 234,000, just shy of 235,000 statute miles from the Earth. So 1968, Borman, who was originally slated to command Apollo 9, now has to change spacecrafts to Apollo 8 and essentially has 4 months to prepare for this mission. Can you talk about the challenges that were involved in making a switch like that, and then what they had to train for and adapt to for this mission?
Well, they had essentially a new spacecraft. After the tragic fire, anything that even hinted of being flammable was removed from the spacecraft. So the interior of the spacecraft was a complete redesign. And of course, that had to go through ground testing. And there are small rockets on board that spacecraft, so they had to be sure that they were operational as well. So that was major. Plus, I think they changed one of the crew members. Lovell was slated for a later mission, and he was assigned to the Apollo 8 mission. So the three crew members then were Borman and Lovell and Bill Landers. So Lovell was added a little bit later. And then they had to start the training. But what we had, of course, to do on the ground, the flight controllers and all our ancillary equipment, is practice for a lunar mission. And no human had ever done that before. And so we had the software and we had the flight dynamics and the trajectories, and we just worked around it. And we were writing the rules as we went along. It was an amazing task.
Yep.
And we practiced a great deal. We called them simulations, but that was practice. And there's a couple of interesting examples of how that benefited us long term.
Yeah, you talk about simulations. So what are some of the things that you learned from simulating this flight, whether it's launch or re-entry, and then some of the adjustments you had to make before you actually send humans on a mission like this?
Well, there was one example that I like to talk about, and that was I was on the. Well, let me back up just a little bit. We had 3 teams of flight controllers on each mission, with the exception, I think, of Apollo 11. We had 4 teams there, so everybody got a chance to work Apollo 11. But on Apollo 8 and most of the missions, there were 3 teams. So I was on the team that backed up. There was the launch team that worked just prior to liftoff from the Cape, and then maybe an hour or 2 into the mission. And then at that point in time, the next team came in. Let's call them Team B. And I was a member of that team. So we had practiced a mid-course correction after we completed translunar injection. We're on our way to the moon. We did a mid-course correction to fine-tune our trajectory to the moon and into lunar orbit. So we had practiced that a number of times, and we accomplished that very first day. There was a mid-course correction which we successfully pulled off, and this was the first time that the large rocket engine on the service module was tested. So that was one thing. But there, on another simulation, I was also on the entry team, and the entry team doesn't have all that much to do because that spacecraft is coming back physically, and it's coming through the atmosphere, and you have to, of course, make sure that it's in the right attitude, because if it's too shallow, it won't land, and if it's too steep on re-entry from the moon, the spacecraft could conceivably burn up. And there was one simulation that I remember vividly where we came in, and one of the things we had to do just prior to entry is heat up the thrusters. There were 12 thrusters, reaction control thrusters on that command module that were not used until entry, and they were used to put the spacecraft in the proper attitude so the heat shield is pointing down and will absorb all that energy, that kinetic energy, as the spacecraft enters. You have to have that. It has to come in heat shield first. Well, those thrusters had not been used, of course, for the whole mission. And now remember, this was a practice. This was a simulation. But we were able to simulate very vividly almost the exact mission. So they had not been used, and they've been dormant conceivably for the better part of a week. So the first thing that we did is and they were solenoid activated. So to assure that they would be operational, we put current through the solenoids for 20 minutes to heat them up, because they've been dormant all that time to the moon and back. And so to make sure they would be operational, we put current through those solenoids to heat them up. But before you pressurize the propellants into those thrusters with helium, you have to turn off the current. Well, in this particular simulation, the crew put the current through the solenoids, but they forgot to turn the current off prior to pressurization. They pressurized, and what happened was those solenoids were open, and we hosed out all the propellant, all of it. We lost it all We had no attitude control on entry, and we came in nose first, which meant that the heat shield was 180 degrees turned around from the direction it was. We would have burned up. That was the simulation. So as a result of that, they added one step to the crew checklist to pull the circuit breaker to make sure that that current was turned off. And that was the purpose of the simulations, to learn things like that and then make the appropriate adjustments in the instructions to the crew, and not only the onboard crew, but the ground crew as well, so that we learn from that.
Right. This is why you simulate, right? So you have
that's why you simulate. And that's the one example that I like to quote whenever I'm talking to people about that, because that's the one I remember. And I remember being on the console and hearing it was the backup crew that was in the simulator at that time, not the prime crew for Apollo 8, but the backup.
Who was the backup crew?
Glad you asked. One was an astronaut by the name of Neil Armstrong. The other one was an astronaut by the name of Buzz Aldrin. And the third one was Fred Hayes. So two names that are familiar to us. And I think it was Aldrin who made the comment in the simulation, we're going in nose first. And at that point in time, the simulation people terminated the simulation, and we proceeded to debrief.
And in the debriefing, that's when you added the step.
Yes.
The circuit breaker step.
As a result.
This is why you simulate. This is what happens in the trenches as you're preparing for a mission like this.
That's why we simulate. And there's lots of other examples. That's just the main one I remember.
Yep.
And I remember it vividly.
Yep. Fascinating. All right. December 21, launch date. Tell me where you were.
I was home. I was watching it because it was early Saturday morning. But I was home watching that launch and knowing that in a couple of hours, I got to be ready to drive into NASA. It wasn't that far, about 10 miles, and then relieve the launch team and take my spot on the console. And my responsibility was the propulsion systems on the command module and primarily the service module. The command module propulsion systems, of course, weren't actuated until re-entry. But for all the other maneuvers and control of the propulsion systems on the service module were my responsibility.
Yep.
And so my position was probably to get in there. I forget the time of day. It was around noon. Perhaps launch was early, around 7 o'clock, if I remember, 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. And so I got in there a few hours later and relieved the launch team propulsion engineer and assumed my position and got ready to plan for that mid-course correction, which we did a few hours later that first day.
So the launch is a success, and the trip on board the Saturn V rocket, that's another discussion in and of itself. And of course, you show a video clip of this in your Apollo Memories presentation, Frank Borman's reaction to, and really all three of them, to being on board being thrust by this incredible rocket, the most powerful rocket that humans had designed up to this point. So it orbits the Earth for about 2.5 hours, and at that time, there's testing going on. Can you talk about some of the specifics of the testing that's going on before the command is given?
The testing for the mid-course correction you're talking about?
So before the command is given. So Apollo 8,
well, the mid-course correction
module was
in
Earth.
The timeline, and so we all had it planned as to when that would occur, if it would occur, and we had known the only reason it would not have occurred is if during the translunar injection burn that had been so accurate that we didn't need it.
Yeah,
but so we had practiced for that, and that was in the timeline. So basically, it was just a matter of making sure that the crew was in the right attitude to perform the burn, And then generally what we would do is an ullage maneuver with the small, what we call reaction control thrusters on the service module to give the command and the service module a little bit of forward thrust, because we're now in a weightless condition with all these liquid propellants. So we did a ullage maneuver to assure that we had an efficient burn. And then we had a countdown. We got our chart recorders and all our recording equipment ready to go and operating, actually moving, because we had analog chart recorders. And then the burn was countdown and performed. Now, I will say one thing, that on Apollo 8, and I can't speak for the other mission, but I know on Apollo 8, once they finished their translunar injection burn, they were still on that third stage, and they had to decouple from that third stage and get away from that. And I recall Frank Borman saying, we've got to thrust to get away from this thing, because the third stage was starting to, they were afraid that it might gain on the service module, and there might be some sort of a mid-air, or not mid-air, but mid-space collision. So they had to use some propellant, not much, but some propellant, to thrust away from that third stage to get it out of the way, or get out of its way, better way to say it.
Right. That was a mid-course correction as well. So I want to talk about the TLI
mid-course
command.
correction followed by a couple of hours, yes. But that was all planned and in the checklist.
So I want to talk about the TLI command just for a second, because of the significance of this moment. When I think of Apollo 8, it comes down to moments. So testing is complete, and NASA is essentially, Mission Control is essentially giving Apollo 8 the go-ahead to do the TLI burn. And I believe it was Michael Collins, who was actually the Capcom that was on duty.
Michael Collins was the capsule communicator on the ground talking to the crew. Yes, that is right.
Up until this point, all the events in human history had occurred, big or small, within the gravity well of Earth. And now at this point in time, a human being is about to give the go-ahead to another group of human beings to fire a rocket that's going to leave the gravity of well of Earth and move into the sphere of influence of another world. And Michael Collins just sort of recalls that moment, that he said it so matter-of-factly, Apollo 8, you're good for TLI. And yet in the back of his mind, what do you think is happening? He's like, I just gave a command for translunar injection. I mean, obviously you have to be professional. You're on shift and you're following procedure, but there's got to be an element of human emotion taken over here. I just gave the directive for three human beings to leave Earth and go to another world. What's that like?
Well, I can speak for Mike, but I know he's been interviewed about that very moment a lot of times. And Michael Collins was one of most down-to-earth astronauts that I've met, and he would kind of joke about it, because he said here, and he would describe it almost verbatim the way you just described it, Jeremy. And he says, here I am saying in one sentence, you go for TLI, and we're going to send these three men to where they've never been before. Now, I was still at home. And of course, I had listened to and watched the launch. And then, because it was only about an orbit and a half after that we did translunar injection with that third stage. So I knew that was successful. And I was getting ready to go in and start my shift. And I remember this like it was yesterday. As I was driving into the NASA complex, I looked over out of my rear view mirror, the mirror on driver's side, and Bill Moon was coming on my left. And I shot him a thumbs up, and he shot me a thumbs up, because we both knew that Apollo 8 was on its way.
Yeah, amazing. So it's a 3-day journey roughly to the moon. I want to ask you briefly about the command module. I believe it was the command module rocket, because you're going with the CSM, the command and service module. You don't have the lunar module. You have essentially a boilerplate to simulate the weight. but you don't have a full lunar module for this mission.
No, the lunar module wasn't ready, and that's the reason for this whole mission profile. So no, we didn't have the lunar module at all.
But you have one engine to get you there and back. The command module engine.
Yes, the one engine on the service module.
The one engine on the service module, and it has to be fired multiple times.
And that's called the service propulsion system.
Okay, service propulsion system. How many times was that engine fired? I mean, it's multiple times.
Well, it was fired for that first mid-course correction. And that was interesting in itself because that engine had to work if we were going into lunar orbit. And that was another thing that was a first. We didn't just go to the moon and do a flyby and come home, a figure eight, like you see there on the Apollo patch. No, we were going into orbit. Yep. So when we got into the area of the moon, we had to use that engine, that same engine, the service propulsion system, and turn the spacecraft around because we had to slow down to get into lunar orbit, and that engine had to perform.
Right.
And if it didn't perform, the worst case scenario, if it didn't light at all, we'd come around the other side of the moon and be on a free return path to Earth. But it worked. Now we're in lunar orbit, and now what we're celebrating 55 years to almost to the hour this evening is that engine also had to work to give the spacecraft enough thrust and energy to take them out of lunar orbit and on its way back. So that engine had to work twice. The first time was the mid-course correction. And what was interesting is that engine doesn't get recovered or refueled. So it's got to be perfect when we launch it. And right after the mid-course correction, when I say right after, I'm talking about seconds. I turned around, the flight controller in the front room was asking me how it looked, chamber pressure, etc. I turned around, I couldn't even get near my chart recorder because there was Chris Kraft, I think Robert Gilruth, the director of NASA at Houston, several astronauts, and they physically picked up that tracing on our chart recorder, tore it off the recorder mechanism, and walked off and analyzed it with the North American Rockwell contractors, because that engine had to work, and they were going to, this was the only data on the ground that showed the engine performance. And so when our flight controller in the front room asked about its performance, I said, I wish I could tell you, but it's and I was about to say it walked off, but I put it more nicely than that. I said that the administration has the data and are analyzing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the longest 4 minutes of these astronauts' lives is when they were performing the burn to slow down as they were approaching the moon to get into lunar orbit. I believe it was about 4 minutes. It has to be very precise. If you burn too long, you slow down and crash into the moon. If you don't burn long enough, you could skip and miss the moon and fly out into deep space. So
the engine's got to work exactly. And
Yep.
it did.
And it did. So,
and the other interesting thing, though, is all those burns on every mission, not only Apollo 8, but every one subsequent to that, they were all done behind the moon. And so think of an eclipse that we've got coming up in April. The moon eclipses the spacecraft, any voice communication, any data communication between the spacecraft and the Earth. So when they're behind the moon and doing all their burns and all their maneuvers, we have no control, or we have no knowledge of the performance until they come around the other side. We know when they're supposed to appear, and if they appear within a few seconds of what's programmed, then we know everything was fine.
Right. I want to ask you about that in just a second, but I want to show a couple of pictures here. First of all, Apollo 8 was the first mission to take a photograph by human beings of the whole disk of the Earth. You can see this image here. I think it was Bill Anders, who took this one. Just a
I like
magnificent
to call that the world's largest selfie.
Yeah, there you go. Absolutely. So talk to me about Blackout. My dad, I remember him telling stories. To this day, he still talks about just what an ominous moment that was when these 3 astronauts are approaching the moon. They're going to go around the far side and out of radio communication, and there's going to be a period of blackout. And of course, the world was listening at that time, I think mainly by radio, correct me if I'm wrong. So we didn't have the ubiquitous television broadcast that we do today. So those who were listening live, it was primarily radio.
Of the mission were televised, but of course, no one had any information when they were behind the moon.
Right.
And it almost became surreal.
Right. Exactly. It's a surreal moment.
There was nothing anybody could do. We had no data. Your screens essentially went blank. You had no numbers, good, bad, or indifferent. There was nothing there. You couldn't hear them because there was no voice communication. So when I say it's surreal, we knew that we had a period of time, maybe 15 minutes. I don't know exactly, but we had a period of time where, hey, if you needed to take some private time, now's your time. And a lot of people did. They unplugged their headset and went to the restroom. Or
were you on shift at that time? Were you on shift at that time?
Yes.
Okay, so blackout's about to occur. Hopefully they make it. You guys are on your own. I'm going to go use the restroom. That's essentially what it was?
Yes. And the same thing occurred, as I say, on Christmas Eve when it was time to come back. And you'll get into that. Mm-hmm. But I remember our lead flight controller in the front room, Jack Cammon, we were reporting to him. When I say we, I, the propulsion engineer, and my partner, Charlie, who is the guidance and navigation engineer. And of course, Jack Cammon asked us, are we go before we lose signal again? Because they're going to do this burn behind the moon. And we both said, yes, we are. And I remember him to this day. His comment was, God, I hope so.
Wow. Yeah. So you get to the moon. Frank Borman, I think, was resistant at first to taking a large television camera because of the size and weight. And of course, that all has to be factored in as well. But it turns out they did a couple of different television broadcasts and took several pictures of the moon. And of course, this is the first close-up of the surface of the moon by human beings. And another iconic image was also taken. And I don't even want to talk about this one. Can you talk about the moment and the significance of this Earthrise image taken by Bill Anders?
Well, they were in orbit around the moon, and they were busy taking black and white photos of the lunar surface for future missions, especially Apollo 11, as it turned out, the first landing. They were photographing, technically, landing areas on the moon for future missions. And I guess they all, or maybe not all simultaneously, but they looked out the window and saw this. Right. And it was Anders, or one of them said, grab me the color. They had black and white, and they were using Hasselblad camera equipment. And this was film equipment, nothing digital back then. And so they handed him the Hasselblad camera with color film, and they just said, take several. Just, take everything, because they just looked at that remarkable sight and said, no one has ever seen this before. Now, remember, these are 3 men out there who've never seen anything like this. They were the only humans ever to see this Earthrise.
Right.
And so, of course, he documented it. And as one of the authors who wrote books on this subject said afterwards, but on Christmas Eve day, no one knew until they developed that film what they actually had.
Right. We take it for granted today. You take a picture, you click a button, and it's instantly,
and you can proofread it immediately. But no, that film had to be developed.
Right. You had to fly back to Earth, develop the film, and it would be several days, months, however long it took before this image was actually seen, let alone
And
discovered.
right now I have a tie in my closet with that scene on it. So
Yeah.
what human in their wildest imagination ever thought that would make it on someone's tie?
Yeah, absolutely. I got a question here. Is it true that Frank Borman was sick on the way to the moon?
Yes, that is true.
Right. So I think he took a pill to help him sleep. I'm not sure if it was the effects of the sleeping pill or
I think
adapting
that
to
was the only
weightlessness.
time of any mission that he flew. Well, that was his last, that he got sick. He had never been sick before.
Right. And of course, this is a legendary and somewhat graphic story, but space flight does come with its risks, and also,
well, and they're weightless.
Yep. So yeah, the story is true, and it is pretty graphic what happened, because allegedly it was coming out both ends, and of course you're in a weightless environment with feces and vomit molecules flying around. But as Bill Anders said, you just adapt, and
they're heroes. They are heroes.
Yeah, these were soldiers in space. I mean, you look back at the environment at that time, the climate at that time, with the Cold War and the struggle to really, I think, legitimize democracy. That's in my mind, that's really the legacy of these Apollo missions.
Well, another interesting thing about Frank Borman, I can't remember where I heard or read this, but his mission was to beat the Soviets to the moon, and we did that. And once he got back, I think someone in an interview asked him, well, would you go again? He had no interest in going back again for a lot of reasons, not the least of which was the risks. He dearly loved his wife and his family, and he says, I've accomplished what I wanted to do. I beat the Soviets.
Right. As he says, Vietnam was a loss, Korea was a tie, but the moon or the space race was a win. So you're orbiting the Earth, and before the mission,
orbiting the Earth or the moon?
I'm not orbiting the moon. I'm sorry, orbiting the moon. I believe it was 10 orbits over a period of 22 hours that they were in orbit around the moon. Somebody correct me on that. But before the launch, they were told you're going to be there Christmas Eve, 1968, and you're going to be doing a live television broadcast. And as it turns out, more people were watching this live television broadcast than at any other point in human history. I think the estimation is something like 1 in 4 humans on Earth, including those in the Soviet Union, by the way, were watching this broadcast of these 3 astronauts orbiting the moon. And Frank Borman was told, when you get there, say something.
Say something appropriate.
Say something appropriate. What do you want me to say? Something appropriate.
That's all they said.
It goes around and ends up into, this discussion ends up in the hands of a reporter, and he brings it home to his wife. And here's where a woman's touch kind of comes in. And I think it was his wife that actually suggested, why don't they read from the book of Genesis? And we discussed this a year ago also. Before I show this, can you talk about where you were and what went through your mind when you heard this broadcast of Apollo 8 from the moon 55 years ago, Christmas Eve, 1968?
I was on console. I had practiced trans-Earth injection burn, which is coming up. But so this was their last full orbit around the moon, where they had their live TV audience to the Earth. And he was about to say something appropriate. I was on console, and essentially that one slide of our tab, I don't know if you got it handy, but my feeling at that time was that one right there. Across the top, you see 4 columns. Each of those columns is the propellant, or rather the thruster performance, chamber pressure, and so on of each of those 4 reaction control thrusters. And then down the right-hand column, you see SPS, Service Propulsion System. That's the engine that's going to fire to bring them out of a lunar orbit and bring them back to Earth. If that engine doesn't fire, they're going to be permanently in lunar orbit. Right. So I'm fixated on that data. And yes, we could see the out of the hatch from Apollo, we could see the lunar surface in sort of a crescent shape. And of course, we could hear, first of all, Bill Anders and then Jim Lovell and Frank Borman closed the first several verses of Genesis. But I was more fixated on the data. That data had to be right. And then you see on the right, now, if something had leaked, had there been a leak in pressure or something, we could have seen the numbers change. But maybe we would have looked the other way or something. Maybe we would have missed it. So on the right-hand side, you see that picture of someone's pointing. Those are cue lights. And if there was we would set limits, upper and lower limits on all the data, especially things like chamber pressure or helium pressure. And if anything changed outside those limits, we would get probably a red blinking light up there in that row of indicator lights. So they would be our cue lights to warn us that, hey, check your data, something's going wrong. And they were all labeled. So if something went wrong with a particular engine or something, the associated light would blink. So that was a backup and a way to assure that we're not going to miss something. We might miss it if we're looking at the data and we blink, but we're not going to miss a blinking light, especially if it's red. So, but that's really what I was fixated on. And I remember now, I get more emotional now when I think of Apollo 8 and the accomplishments and, the success and all the effort that everybody put into it. I get more emotional now at my late age than I did that particular evening, because I was interested in what the data was telling me and that it was holding solid.
55 years ago, you're on shift, game face on, you're fixated on your console, making sure the numbers are right.
That's right.
And just hoping that engine burns to bring them home.
That's right.
Now you look back, what are your thoughts on the legacy of Apollo 8 and the memories?
It was my favorite mission. There's no question. And I think the main reason is because once we left Earth orbit, after we did translunar injection, everything else was new. We had never done any of it before. Prior to this time, we had done low orbit missions with both Mercury and with Gemini. And with Apollo 7, that was also low Earth orbit. This was new. And there wasn't a human that had ever done it before. And we did it right.
Yeah, I guess, again, I wasn't there. I missed out on this era, and it's such an honor to know guys like you and have these kinds of discussions. But I guess my assessment would be it was an inflection point in the Apollo mission. When you look at the tragedy of 1 to the giant leap of 8, it really meant, okay, we can do this. We're on our way to actually not only going to the moon, but I would say the lunar landing essentially was inevitable. There was still some testing and still some things to overcome yet. But with the success of 8, we knew probably that this was going to get done on Kennedy's timeline.
That's exactly my feeling, Jeremy. The rest of it, and I don't want to begrudge the rest of it, but there was fine tuning what we had accomplished in Apollo 8.
Yep.
Not only did we get to the moon, but we went into lunar orbit, and that was highly significant.
Now that you take a step back and you think of the significance of this broadcast, what I'm about to play, about 1 billion people, 1/4 of the world's population watching, what are your thoughts on the impact? We talked about this a year ago, and of course, hearing John Aaron's reaction and seeing just his face light up when he talks about that is such a moving moment for me personally, because it's one thing to have a discussion. It's another thing to sort of experience living history. I don't know if a moment like this could ever be duplicated again. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, are you talking about the recitation from Genesis or?
Correct.
Personally, as I'm looking at the data like I am now, and I'm reading it, I know where it came from. And my reaction, as I remember, it wasn't emotional. I'm saying, well, that's nice. That certainly is appropriate. And I heard, the 3 voices, and I thought that's perfect.
Now let's get them home.
It was, I couldn't think of anything more appropriate.
Yeah. When the burn is successful, they're out of lunar orbit on their way back to Earth. Are you thinking, okay, we've done it?
Well, I was thinking in agreement with Jim Lovell, who aired to the ground, Houston, be advised, there is a Santa Claus. We knew they had done it successfully because we knew to the second when they should appear and when we should start seeing our data downloaded again from the spacecraft, if the burn had been successful and if they had picked up enough energy and velocity to leave lunar orbit, and they had in fact done that. So yes, there's I wouldn't say a selective audible sigh of relief, but everybody was relieved from then on. And of course, if the rest of it was, all right, let's get this coast from the moon back to Earth successful. And we started to prepare for that. All the time, though, watching for any anomaly that might occur. And none occurred on this mission, but go back to Apollo 13. It did on that mission. Yeah.
And then kind of the final stage, separation from command and service module, orientation of the command module, and then reentry. Any apprehension, any anxiety with that procedure?
Well, I was on the entry team. We have rehearsed it. But the only thing I think I can recall from that is we knew they were coming in. And then eventually, of course, with once it picks up speed and you have that plasma buildup over that heat shield, you lose your data again. There's about 3 or 4 minutes of blackout, and you have no data. That happened on Mercury, and it happened on every space flight. On final entry, you just lose data for a time. But I do remember the next thing is, well, when will we see them? We'll see them when they're on their 3 chutes, those huge chutes that are probably 100 feet in diameter. And there's 3 of them to slow the spacecraft down before it splashes into the ocean. And so I, for one, got fixated on watching my screen, and says, there they are. Somebody pointed out, no, that's a bird.
Yeah. And of course, you talk about
I got kidded a lot about that.
That as a flight controller, that's your moment when you see those 3 chutes.
That's right. Yep. That's right.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time, Bill, especially on a holiday.
We've been through an hour. I can't believe that. It seems like about 10 minutes.
I know it goes fast, I tell you. And Santa's on his way, so I know we've got to prepare for the next holiday here. But again, I wanted to thank you for taking the time out of your holiday to kind of relive these memories. I couldn't help but think of the significance of this moment, the evening of Christmas Eve, 55th anniversary, especially after, a very turbulent year in 1968. And those 3 men, those 3 astronauts, Jim Lovell, Frank Borman, and Bill Anders, I believe, were named Time Magazine's Men of the Year as a result of that mission. And
very shortly afterwards, they had a joint session of Congress, the 3 of them. Yep. Yeah, they were heroes. Well, it was special. It was just special.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
We had accomplished so many of the major objectives to lunar landing. We accomplished about 5 of them in that one mission. It was just incredible. And when you stop to think of that, the decision to change the mission objectives of Apollo 8, that was only done in August of 68, and we did it before the end of 68. It was just incredible. But again, I will say it was done with a lot of sharp young engineers out of college. It was their first assignment, and having gotten their bachelor's degree, and just some good, sharp engineers who thought on their feet. It became a team. They practiced a lot, but they were good at what they did.
Absolutely. improvisation. Well, thanks again, Bill, and I'll end
Well,
with
let's
this.
thank our audience. I don't know how many folks are out there, but we hope you enjoyed it. And just think that this is 50 years almost to the hour, if not the minute, that all this actually occurred.
Yep.
And I'm honored to be a part of it.
And I'm honored to relive it with you. So with that, we will actually play here a clip from these three astronauts orbiting the moon 55 years ago today as we wrap up. And for Bill Weppner, I'm Jeremy Veldman. Want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a happy holiday season.
Merry Christmas, folks.
We're now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning was the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning was the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night. Thanks again.
Amen. Good night.